And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Today's sea ice analysis showing the Bering Strait here almost closed off now with ice, and even the Chukchi Sea here at a slower rate, or still more open sea ice free water up here, but even that's starting to close off slowly. And so this area could close off any time now. And looking at the weather for tonight, here's the next storm system coming up, spreading snow into Kodiak Island, Alaska Peninsula, increasing winds over the western Alaska Peninsula and southern Bering Sea. And tomorrow, that low center, quite a strong one here, tracks up to just south of Kodiak Island or to the southwest there. Winter storm warnings out for Bristol Bay for heavy snow and blowing snow. Also, snow and blowing snow on the increase here, with a good increase in the winds for the south central Alaska area, and increasing moisture for the North Gulf Coast as that warm front approaches. And then that system Monday really doesn't move a whole lot. A new low develops here. Old front here, kind of right in this area along this band of snow as the next system comes northward, but still snow here with a trough across south central Alaska. Winter storm warning out now for the Copper River Basin areas as the winter storm warning ends over Bristol Bay. Cold air continues to pour southward here across the eastern Bering Sea, all the way to the Aleutians, with numerous snow showers from the Pribilofs to the Fox Islands. Snow and blowing snow likely, though, for the Alaska Peninsula. And for coastal water forecast for the south coast of the Panhandle, west to southwest winds, 15 knots in the central coast. Light winds tomorrow, southwest at 15. And inside waters, Lynn Canal, south winds 15 knots, southeast at 15 for Stevens Passage, light northwest breeze at 10 knots for Clarence Strait. Then on Monday, south coast here, south winds 30 to 35 knots, with gale warnings here for the central and north coast out of the south and southeast at 35 to 40 knots, with seas up to 22 feet in the north coast. And for Lynn Canal, southeast winds 20 knots with 4-foot seas, and southeast winds 20 knots with gusts of 35 knots for Stevens Passage. Southeast winds 25, gusting 40 knots for Clarence Strait. And for the North Gulf Coast tomorrow, southeast winds 35 knots, seas 10 feet. East winds 30 knots for Prince William Sound and the western North Gulf Coast. Gale warnings for the Barren Islands, east winds 40 knots, and storm warnings for Kamishak Bay. Winds right out of the east at 50 knots with 18-foot seas. Northeast winds 45 knots in the forecast for southern Cook Inlet. And even gale warnings are out for northern Cook Inlet for northeast winds at 35 knots. And then for Monday, south winds 20 knots for southern Cook Inlet. Northeast 25 for northern Cook Inlet. West 25 Kamishak Bay. Southwest winds 25 knots for the Barren Islands. And the North Gulf Coast, south winds 30 to 40 knots, strongest east of Middleton Island. Gale warnings for the Prince William Sound area, south winds 35 knots, seas 9 feet. Kodiak Island, east to southeast winds for Sunday at 30 knots. North winds 30 knots here for Bristol Bay, all the way down the coastline to Cape Sarachev. And then from Cape Sarachev here up toward Sitkinak, look for east to north winds 25 to 35 knots. And for Monday, Kodiak Island, west-southwest winds 25 to 30 knots. Northwest winds down to 15 knots for Bristol Bay. And the Alaska Peninsula is still pretty windy. Northwest winds 30 to 35 knots blowing across the peninsula there, with seas anywhere from 7 to 14 feet. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, north winds 30 to 35 knots. Adak and Atka, north winds 25 knots. And getting out west there, Kiska to Shimia, those winds drop off to 15 knots. And for the Monday afternoon hours, as that next front, not that strong, but strong enough to pull the winds back up to 30 knots from the south there, Kiska to Shimia. Otherwise, lighter winds from Chitka Island. Northwest winds 25 knots for Adak and Atka. And the Eastern Aleutians, northwest winds 30 knots. And for the Norton Sound Zone, north winds 15 knots, north at 15 for St. Lawrence Island, north 20 for the Yukon Delta Coast. Small craft advisories for the Kuskokwim Delta Coast, north at 30 knots, north 30 knots for the Pribilofs, and north 30 knots for St. Matthew Island. And for the Monday afternoon period, we're looking at, or actually all day Monday, gale warnings for St. Matthew Island, north winds 35 knots, north winds 30 knots, St. Lawrence Island, all the way down to the Pribilofs. Stronger here for the Kuskokwim Delta coastline, north at 40 knots. and north 25. So brisk wind advisories out for Norton Sound. And light winds for the central and western Arctic coast tomorrow. North at 5 knots, Chukchi Sea, north to northeast 15 to 20 knots, and west winds 10 to 15 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coastline. And on Monday, north to northeast breeze 5 to 10 knots for the eastern Chukchi Sea, otherwise north winds 10 knots for the central and western Arctic coast. And the Chukchi Sea, north winds 25 to 35 knots, strongest down toward the Bering Strait.